Cohen administration investigation. Now, people familiar with the matter tell the Wall Street Journal that the criminal probe is looking into whether the committee misspent some of the $107 million it raised and, quote, whether some of the committee's top donors gave money in exchange for access to the incoming Trump administration, policy concessions, or to influence official administration positions. The Journal also reports investigators have spoken to this man, Rick Gates, about the inaugural committee's spending. Gates previously served as the deputy Trump campaign manager and deputy chairman of Trump's inaugural committee. He's currently cooperating with federal prosecutors as part of his plea deal. The report of an investigation into Trump's inaugural committee comes as NBC News confirms Donald Trump was the third person in the room in August of 2015 who was talking about hush money payments to women with Michael Cohen and National Enquirer publisher David Pecker, the guy on the right. Remember, Trump keeps saying he had no knowledge of this. It wasn't illegal. It didn't even happen. Federal prosecutors in New York said in a press release yesterday that American Media, that's the parent of the National Enquirer, admitted to making a $150,000 payment, quote, in concert with the campaign, and that there was a meeting between Cohen, Pecker, and, quote, at least one other member of the campaign. The news tonight, that other person, the third person in the room, Donald J. Trump himself. These new reports dropped just hours after the president's increasingly desperate attempts to distance himself from Michael Cohen and his former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, attempts that are often contradictory and obviously false. Take Cohen. This morning, Trump said Michael Cohen should have known better than to break campaign finance laws because Cohen is a lawyer. But hours later, Trump tried to claim that Cohen was actually just a PR flack.
First of all,
that was his title.
He did very low-level work.
Why did you need him?
He did more public relations than he did law, but he did stuff. You'd see him on television. He was okay on television.
In a matter of hours, Trump picked his own argument apart. Then the president falsely claimed that Michael Flynn did not lie to the FBI. He did. And that prosecutors recommended Flynn not serve any jail time because, quote, they're embarrassed. They're not. Look.
What's going on right now with General Flynn? The FBI said he didn't lie.
I saw your tweet on that about
But
this.
Mueller said he did lie. So they took a man who's a general and a respected person and a nice man. And I don't even know what he said about me because, you know, maybe they scared him enough that he'll make up a story. But I have a feeling that maybe he didn't. He's a tougher kind of a guy than Cohen. But they took a general that they said didn't lie, and they convinced him he did lie, and he made some kind of a deal. And now they're recommending no time. You know why? Because they're embarrassed that they got caught.
They said he didn't lie. They're embarrassed. Who's they? For the record, which is in front of you, Michael Flynn said in federal court that he entered into his guilty plea voluntarily, and he entered a plea of guilty because he is guilty and for no other reason. They said he didn't lie. There's no they. It's no surprise that this week of stunning developments has the president on edge. NBC News reporting Trump, quote, has told people close to him in recent days he's alarmed by the prospect of impeachment, according to multiple sources, end quote. Joining us now, Joyce Vance, former federal prosecutor, MSNBC legal contributor, and Harry Litman, former federal prosecutor and deputy assistant attorney general under President Clinton. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. Joyce, help me make sense of Donald Trump's crazy interview with Fox in which he's just sort of said, I don't know, he always says they. Who's the they who says Michael Flynn didn't lie?
You know, the they in this case, I think, is maybe the deep state they, this fictitious cabal that Trump sees at every juncture that gets in his way. But the reality is this. You reach a point when you listen to him where you realize that when prosecutors investigate him, they're corrupt and evil. When the FBI finds evidence against him, there's something wrong with the FBI. When judges rule against him, they must be corrupt. And so we know that they is really a fiction in Donald Trump's mind. And in reality, as that evidence mounts from a variety of sources, it is far more likely that the reality is simply that Donald Trump has violated the criminal laws of the United States and it's catching up with him.
Joyce Vance, I never want to contravene anything you're saying, but Harry Litman, Donald Trump says that what Joyce says is not true. He tweeted this morning that this was not campaign. Now we're talking about Michael Cohen. Right? He says this was not campaign finance. This is the payment that Michael Cohen made Stormy Daniels and the one that he made to American media to pay Karen McDougal. This was not campaign finance. Cohen was guilty on many charges unrelated to me, but he pled to 2 campaign charges which were not criminal and of which he probably was not guilty even on a civil basis. Those charges were just agreed to by him in order to embarrass the president and get a much reduced prison sentence. Harry Litman, again, it's just not true what the president has tweeted there.
I also wouldn't want to contravene anything Joyce says, but it's only because she's always right. But
That's
here,
right.
it's pretty straightforward. There's an element almost, as I watched it again, Ali, of pathos to seeing the leader of the free world making up lie after lie in such short order. It's an almost dazzling lie here to say Michael Cohen has just pleaded guilty to something that isn't a crime and a judge accepted it. It's a complete fantasy and only the latest in an increasing series of ever weaker excuses. And, this has been a blockbuster week. Everything is coming home more and more to the president and his immediate circle. The revelations of today, I think, bring peril even potentially to Melania. And just everyone around him now seems to be really implicated. And the epicenter of it all, of course,
So both of you are former
States.
U.S. attorneys, former prosecutors.
Yeah.
You're not strangers to people lying, but what's often very interesting to you is real evidence that helps prove that. Donald Trump, a Trump ally, has told NBC News, and I think this part's interesting, that impeachment or whatever comes to Donald Trump as a consequence for all of this lying and all of the misdeeds may hinge on David Pecker. I'm very interested in this, the head of American Media Incorporated and the non-prosecute, I don't know what the term is, but the agreement that he's come into with the Southern District of New York, and Alan Weisselberg, the CFO of the Trump Organization, Joyce, who, when there was that recording of Donald Trump and Michael Cohen, Cohen makes reference to Alan Weisselberg and David Pecker, right? These are the 4 people who are included in whatever transaction took place. Weisselberg wrote the checks. He's known the Trumps forever. He knew Donald Trump's father and wrote the checks for him, too. Between these 2 guys, there may be stories we don't even know about.
So we've talked a time or two about this idea that prosecutors don't just rely on the uncorroborated word of one witness. Michael Cohen will never take the witness stand in a future case and testify without any backup. Instead, what prosecutors do will have layer and layer of evidence that confirms and reinforces the strength of their case. And that's what we see now. We've got Weisselberg, the check writer. We've got David Pecker at AMI. There's some indication that the chief operating officer at AMI is also cooperating. And each of these people will have given prosecutors evidence, and prosecutors will have painstakingly corroborated it, either with documents or perhaps, we have this titillating detail that there may be more audio tapes from Michael Cohen, but it will all be a very solidly built building rather than something that would crumble. And that's the strength that we see emerging now in these cases that the Southern District of New York has the reputation for putting together so meticulously.
I guess, Harry, the question I have for you is, what do you do as a prosecutor with a case that is built around the testimony of a whole lot of people who were involved in crooked enterprise?
You bring it every week. The majority of big cases are built exactly that way, and the defense always says, oh, but he's a liar, as the senators have said, and the prosecution always says, as Joyce just pointed out, look, there's corroborating evidence. For my money, by the way, the biggest development in a blockbuster week is the revelation that Trump is the third man in the room who not only oversees but actually directs and convenes the whole activity. Sits down to Pecker and says, "What can you do for me?" It's all instigated with him. But now we'll have at least 2 corroborators there. All of this will have corroboration, and the prosecution could say, if it ever went to a jury, which it probably won't, You don't have to take Michael Cohen's word for it alone. Here are the tapes. Here's the evidence. Here's your common sense. There's a wealth of material there that would let a prosecutor bring the case.
I mean, Joyce, I feel like that's a huge piece of information that Harry just made reference to there, that there were 3 people in that room in August of 2015 talking about paying hush money to women so that it wouldn't interfere with the campaign, and Donald Trump was one of them. Other than the fact that that's interesting, the fact that Donald Trump has been remarkably consistent at denying that he knew anything about this, and then when he figured out that everybody else knew that he knew something about this, that it wasn't really a thing and it wasn't about the campaign and that it wasn't a campaign finance violation. Again, talk to me about this as a prosecutor. The guy was there when they made the decision to pay the money.
If Donald Trump was one of your kids and talked to you like that, you'd send him to his room without dinner, right? This is just lie after lie, and as the truth emerges, he sort of shifts his story to conform, but it's always a new lie. And so what prosecutors now have is the folks who were in the room with him. That matters. That's critically important because for these campaign finance fraud counts, the law is a little bit different. Typically, ignorance of the law is no excuse. But here for campaign finance, you have to actually prove that a putative defendant knew he was violating the law. You don't have to show that he knew he was violating this particular campaign finance law, just that he knew that his conduct was illegal. And so the conversations that were held first person with Donald Trump in that room could be really important in this area. And if I can just go back and confirm what Harry was saying about the way prosecutors build cases, as you pointed out, where the defense comes forward and says, you know, all of these witnesses are liars. Well, that's prosecutors' stock in trade. And the argument that you make as a prosecutor, and juries understand this, is that the prosecutors didn't pick the witnesses. The defendant picked the witnesses. It's Donald Trump in this case who hired these people, who worked with these people, and who conspired with them.
This is an important point. America, thanks to both of you for your help in helping us analyze these things. Joyce Vance and Harry Litman, thank you to both of you. Coming up, NBC News also reports that the president is very worried about investigations from the incoming Democratic majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressman Mike Quigley, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, joins me next. And is President Trump's bizarre series of interviews opening him up to even more trouble? We're back with more on tonight's breaking news that the multiple investigations into Donald Trump continue to grow, with federal prosecutors now looking into Trump's inaugural campaign fund, an investigation that arose partly from materials obtained in the raid on Michael Cohen's home, office, and hotel room. Earlier today, former Michael Cohen lawyer Lanny Davis said Michael Cohen has a lot more to say.
I believe Mr. Cohen will have an opportunity before probably a congressional committee to answer every question and to tell the full story about what he knows about Mr. Trump.
I'm joined now by Mike Quigley, Democratic congressman from Illinois, a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining me tonight. Do you and I can't really speak of the House Intelligence Committee anymore in the last 2 years because it feels like two separate bodies, the Republicans on the House Intel Committee and the Democrats on the House Intel Committee. So do you and your Democratic colleagues at least want to interview Michael Cohen?
Oh, absolutely. And look, I don't hold any animosity toward Mr. Cohen. He seems to have finally come to terms with this, and I take him to his word that he wants to cooperate. So if he's finally willing to open up and tell us exactly what took place, particularly with meetings with the Russians or information about how money flowed through the Trump organization, was there money laundering, we would absolutely love to let him speak unabated about all such things. We have to remember that the special counsel's role is different than ours. His decision is who to bring to justice. Ours is to find out exactly what happened, how to prevent it in the future, and how to inform the American public.
So there, and I think you make a good point that there are things the special counsel's looking into. There's things that the Southern District of New York, the United States Attorney, is looking into. There's things that the Attorney General in New York are looking into, and there are things that you might look into. Mother Jones has published a story tonight in which it says, quote, Flynn said he discussed with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak a grand bargain in which Moscow would cooperate with the Trump administration to resolve the Syrian conflict, and Washington would end or ease up on the sanctions imposed on Russia. These sanctions imposed on Russia were sanctions that were imposed because of human rights violations. They were sanctions imposed because of the Russian incursion into a sovereign country, Ukraine. This is obviously an area that you're going to want to inquire about because these were congressionally imposed sanctions in some cases.
Sure, these were also sanctions that involved the Russian attack on our democratic process. Before President Trump became President Trump, they were already trying to circumvent and coordinate with the Russians in this extraordinary mix of personal business, professional, political worlds. I once described it as a cesspool. As you see the news break, as you described at the opening of the show, this isn't a cesspool. This is a much larger body of water, but it is certainly just as foul.
If it were just a cesspool, it would be manageable. Sir, I know that you had a meeting, or that Gina Haspel, the head of the CIA, has briefed you on some of the matters having to do with Jamal Khashoggi and the Saudi involvement in that. And I imagine you might be able to tell me some of what you heard, but you might have to kill me. So let me quote to you what Senator Corker said about this. Let me play for you what he said, and then I want to get your thoughts on it. Let's listen together.
We've got a crown prince that's out of control. I was in the most recent intelligence briefing, the most crisp and clear intelligence briefing I've been a part of in 12 years, by far. If he was before a jury, the crown prince, he would be convicted, in my opinion, in 30 minutes. Okay, I've never seen such compelling evidence in an intelligence briefing. Never.
So that's interesting. Without telling us what you heard in the intelligence briefing, can you concur that the evidence is compelling?
Let me be clear. I have been in several briefings, none of them with the director, but I have been briefed, I think, pretty thoroughly on the Saudi situation with the murdered journalist. But I also have served on the Intelligence Committee for 4 years. I have traveled to the kingdom. Common sense and that wealth of experience have told me there is absolutely no way the Crown Prince doesn't have knowledge of this before it happens. And everything I've learned since then convinces me that he directed this, and the United States needs to respond accordingly. A lot of those briefings dealt with the fact, a reminder, hey, the Saudis are really important to us. That's absolutely true. We have to remind ourselves, though, that our moral standing in the world matters. It is one of those things that makes our country special. And when we start doing attacks on our moral standing, when we build walls, when we pull out of treaties, when we talk about America first, that combination of things sets us apart. It isolates us. In the final analysis, if all we're talking about is America first, that doesn't work. It makes us less safe. It keeps us isolated from the world, and our friends simply don't trust us.
So as it relates to Russia or Saudi Arabia or anyone else, the president seems to have a very binary view of disagreements with those countries, that these sanctions are equated to war. I mean, the whole point of sanctions is that it's not war. It's not an end of all relationships with other countries. You can continue to have certain relationships, but these are the signals that say that you don't share values or activities that have occurred. That is definitely the water that the president has muddied when it comes to both Saudi Arabia and Russia.
Yes, when the Russians invade and take over large areas of Ukraine, when they have a war going on with one of our allies, the alternative to war is diplomacy and sanctions. When the Russians attack our democratic process, our first reaction must be, as President Obama did, telling them to cut it out, and if they don't, we sanction them, and then we take the next step. These are subtleties lost upon a president who doesn't believe in the role of the Justice Department, the independence of the intelligence community, and a healthy State Department whose actions will prevent wars and And instead, what he's done is gut that State Department. Collectively, all this does is make America more vulnerable to our enemies.
Congressman Quigley, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining me tonight. Congressman Mike Quigley is a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Coming up, is Jared Kushner going to be the next White House Chief of Staff? That and other bizarre news from the White House is next.
We're interviewing people now for Chief of Staff, yes.
How long is the shortlist now?
5 people, really good ones, terrific people, mostly well-known.
The Huffington Post and CBS News are reporting that one well-known person under consideration to be the Chief of Staff for the White House is Jared Kushner, who met with Trump to discuss the job yesterday. I'm not making this stuff up. Unlike some other possible candidates, Kushner wouldn't have to worry about lawyering up. He already has, and has for some time, been paying a defense lawyer to represent him with the special counsel's office. But of all the candidates, thanks to Twitter and President Trump's predilection for TV cameras, they know what they're getting into. After 2 days of coverage about Trump's promise to shut down the government if Democrats don't vote for $5 billion to build the wall with Mexico, the president tweeted early this morning, quoting himself, that Mexico is paying for the wall. I often stated, one way or the other, Mexico is going to pay for the wall. This has never changed. Our new deal with Mexico and Canada, the USMCA, is so much better than the old, very costly and anti-USA NAFTA deal that just by the money we save, Mexico is paying for the wall. Just by the money we save, Mexico is paying for the wall, which makes the Mexico is paying for the wall a lie. Today, in an interview with Fox News, Trump was asked about the General Motors plant closures in Ohio.
And the nation got to see you as GM said, you know what, we're going to wipe away 15% of the workforce right before Christmas. And you said, I want to talk.
Yeah,
to
I
Ms.
called
Barrow.
her. I don't like what she did. I
The
think
CEO,
it was
Ms. Barrow.
nasty. It doesn't really matter because Ohio is under my leadership from a national standpoint. Ohio is going to replace those jobs like in 2 minutes.
Ohio is not under the president's leadership, and they're not actually replacing those jobs in 2 minutes. But 2 minutes further into the interview, there were still no new jobs in Ohio. Joining us now, Neera Tanden, president of the Center for American Progress. She was Hillary Clinton's policy director during the 2008 presidential campaign. Nicholas Kristof, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times. Welcome to both of you. Nick, I want to go into ancient history. February of 2018, when you wrote this in the New York Times, and it pertained to the Rob Porter scandal at the time. And you wrote, dishonor is like a cancer that spreads inexorably as it feeds upon ambition, protects itself with lies, and doubles down with cover-ups. Looking at the chaos in the White House these days, I worry about inexperience, incompetence, and lack of judgment, but maybe I worry most about an utter lack of integrity and the way it is proving infectious. Nick, you wrote that in February.
That was about 10 cancers ago.
10 cancers ago, yeah. This is a real problem.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's striking, and I think it compounds itself in that the White House has become such a bizarre and infectious place. The good people don't want to work there, don't want to work for the administration, and so only tainted people who may be able to monetize the White House are more inclined to do so. And I must say that, I mean, the very idea that Jared Kushner would be considered for Chief of Staff seems to me to play into both the integrity issues and the capacity issues. I mean, this is coming right after we have the disaster with Saudi Arabia, and we have the architect of that relationship with the Crown Prince, Jared Kushner, who had his own ethical and financial issues with Saudi Arabia, now being considered for Chief of Staff. I mean, it's just incredible.
And I don't know whether it's kind of interesting the way you divide that into integrity issues and capacity issues, because they are both really serious, right? Integrity is really serious, and the ability, Neera Tanden, for this White House to get things done. The White House Chief of Staff is not just the Chief of Staff of a bunch of people who work in the White House. This is a job that is crucially important for the functioning of America.
I mean, honestly, after this week where we have more and more criminal activity that's been pointed to, it really seems a lot. I have to say, it seems a little bit like the mafia. I mean, essentially, the president can't rely on anyone who is not related to him at this point to do anything because who else is actually going to be a person you could rely on? Essentially, he has to get relatives to do jobs for him because he already has a hold on them. I mean, what competent person is going to enter a White House that is so demonstrably incompetent, but under so many investigations? I mean, just the revelations in the last 24 hours would make most rational people run for their lives. So, I think I think this is a problem where the president's integrity and incompetence is costing us at a greater and greater pace.
So, Nicholas Kristof, there's another matter here, and that is that it is not healthy for a country to have a party, a Republican Party, or any party that is experiencing abject critical failure. Claire McCaskill was on Morning Joe today talking about what her Republican counterparts say about Donald Trump behind his back. Let's listen together.
Nuts, weak, doesn't really understand government, doesn't care to understand anything complicated, asks and says the most unbelievable things in meetings that clearly shows he doesn't understand the subject matter, no intellectual curiosity. I believe history will judge down the line those members of the Republican Party who have silently looked down and think they can just wait this out without even speaking up about the level of lying that goes on.
So I think the last sentence there is the most important. There's nobody who needs to be concerned about whether Donald Trump or needs to be convinced that Donald Trump doesn't tell the truth. But this is the issue. There are people on Capitol Hill who can fix this, who can do something, who can confront the president. And many of those people are members of the Republican Party, particularly in the Senate, who have chosen not to time and time and time again.
You know, I find there's a huge distinction between Republicans in Congress, for instance, who are completely aware of the president's shortcomings, of his lies, and so on, and the Republican base. And, you know, in my hometown in rural Oregon, people are very much standing by President Trump. Mm-hmm. They don't believe he lies or don't care about the lies. And I think that as long as the economy is strong, mm-hmm. They will support him. And as a result, every Republican member of Congress feels obliged to stick with him because they're more concerned about a primary challenge in most cases than about a general election defeat. And so I think that they have, you know, they know that the things they say in defense of President Trump are not true, but they are afraid of being defeated in a primary.
Let's talk about that, Neera. Fox News has a poll that was taken between December 9th and 11th about President Trump's job performance amongst registered voters. 46% approve. A little bit fascinating. 46% approve, 52% disapprove. This is kind of interesting. 2 years in after the blunders that Donald Trump has committed, he's got a lot of support.
He does, but I think actually this week has really been a sea change because this week we saw what an empowered Congress, an empowered Democratic House would actually mean. When Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer sat in front of him, argued with him, told him he was wrong, actually stated facts, did things that you would expect Republican leaders could have done 2 years ago but never did, because Nick is right, they were worried about a primary. But what we should also remember is a lot of Republicans lost their seats on November 6th because they would not be a check on Donald Trump. Democrats had a historic victory. Much of what has fueled that victory was a desire to have somebody speak truth, reality, to Donald Trump. That happened this week. And what happened? He caved. He caved immediately. He said immediately it was his shutdown. His whole staff must have been like ripping their hair out. So I think, you know, Nick is right that the Republican Party has this problem, but the majority of the country still, and I believe that majority will grow over the next 2 years, but the majority of the country recognizes that Donald Trump is lying, is incompetent, and they want a different direction, and that's what they voted for.
Neera, thank you for tonight for your analysis. Neera Tanden. Nick Kristof, stay close by. I want to talk to you. You just come back from Yemen, and I want to have that discussion with you in a bit. Coming up today, Maria Butina has pleaded guilty to being a foreign agent, but questions remain. What does she know A stunning line in her plea agreement suggests prosecutors think that she could be very valuable to future investigations. Malcolm Nance and Joyce Vance join us next. Today, for the first time, a Russian agent pleaded guilty in federal court to illegally trying to interfere in U.S. politics ahead of the 2016 election. Maria Butina agreed to cooperate with investigators and admitted that as early as 2015, she illegally conspired to establish unofficial lines of communication with members of the National Rifle Association and the Republican Party, according to court documents. Quote, Butina sought to use those unofficial lines of communication for the benefit of the Russian Federation. She took direction from Alexander Torshin, this man, the former deputy head of Russia's central bank, who is close to Vladimir Putin. Butina's activities, including bringing top NRA members to Moscow in 2015 to meet high-level Russian officials, court documents say. After that meeting, she messaged Torshin, quote, we should let them express their gratitude now. We will put pressure on them quietly later. She also met Donald Trump Jr. in 2016 at a dinner hosted by the NRA. And today's guilty plea is raising new questions about the exchange that she had with Donald Trump during the campaign. Watch this.
I'm visiting from Russia, so my question...
Good friend of Obama.
If you would be elected as a president, what will be your foreign politics, especially in the relationships with my country? And do you want to continue the politics of sanctions that are damaging of both economy, or you have any other ideas?
I believe I would get along very nicely with Putin, okay? And I mean where we have the strength. I don't think you'd need the sanctions.
Joining us now, Malcolm Nance, an MSNBC counterterrorism and intelligence analyst, and back with us is Joyce Vance. Welcome to both of you. Malcolm, just put this into perspective. In all the noise and everything else that's been going on, Maria Butina's sort of been in the background. She's now pleaded guilty. But what, and I've heard you describe this before, so I want you to do it again. What is the role that we need to see Maria Butina having played in Russian interference in the election?
You know, there's a big debate going on right now, I know, in media about was she actually a spy or was she an independent person who just thought this thing up and wrote a paper and just came out and exercised all this influence to the benefit of Russia. She's one or the other, but all the indicators is that she's at a minimum an intelligence subcontractor who was tasked out with Alexander Torshin to go out and cut this influence campaign. What's missing from this story, which to us begins in 2015, but for her, it begins in 2011 when she was a member of the Youth Guard of the United Russia, a political body that falls under Vladimir Putin. And a mentor was Anna Chapman, a Russian spy who was caught in the United States and in 2010 deported and became one of Putin's favorites. She, between 2011 and 2015, Butina, was missing in action because she was developing the Right to Bear Arms organization with Alexander Torshin.
Which is weird, by the way, in Russia.
Before we start.
Because there's no civilian right to bear arms in Russia.
There is no right to bear arms here. We have 240 million firearms. They have 6 million, and they're all hunting shotguns. So this organization was crafted for 3 years to launch operations in 2015. That means there was a lot of prep, and they knew precisely what her and Alexander Torshin were doing, which was to be one spoke going after the hub in a wheel of Russian intelligence operations to get Donald Trump. And if you remember one quick point, Donald Trump actually started his communications with Russia in 2012 and 2013. So this is old school, in-depth intelligence operation.
Joyce Vance, there's a very interesting part of Maria Butina's plea agreement, which reads, your client acknowledges that your client's cooperation may include, but will not necessarily be limited to, participating in covert law enforcement activities. Caught my attention. What does that mean to a prosecutor?
It's hard to know if we should read too much into it. This is fairly standard language in a plea agreement where you require a cooperator to do anything that law enforcement might need them to do. typically your ability to do much that's covert is very limited once people are aware that you've pled guilty. You know, before you plead guilty, it might be possible to make phone calls or wear a wire. That's much more difficult after folks are aware that you're cooperating, and in her case, you're in custody. But it still leaves open the possibility that she might have, leading up to this plea, engaged in conversations with people or other activity that we'll learn about as future cases built on her cooperation progress.
Malcolm, I just want to dig a little bit more into this gun thing. McClatchy reported in January that the FBI is investigating whether Alexander Torshin illegally funneled money to the National Rifle Association to help Donald Trump win the presidency. Two sources familiar with the matter have told McClatchy. So we know that Torshin was a mentor or something to Butina, and we know that she was involved in NRA contact with the Russian government, and we know she was involved in some right to bear arms organization. And we know that the National Rifle Association funded Donald Trump at a level that they have never funded a presidential candidate before. Are you able to make sense of all these disparate parts?
Yes. Well, first off, Torshin was her boss, and she and he, in 2011, created this organization out of thin air. She was a furniture salesman in Siberia at age 19, and then by the time she shows up at age 21, she's with Torshin for 3 years, meeting Americans, crafting this gun organization. And then fast forward up to 2015, they're sponsoring conferences in Russia, bringing Americans over, including Sheriff Clark and the head of the NRA, and talking about gun rights in a country that has zero gun rights. And then they go back to the United States and they start spreading their influence by meeting people, by showing her in sexily clad photographs with weapons. And that captures the imagination of people. She rapidly moves up the chain of command and starts meeting with very popular people, and then manipulated her boyfriend, Paul Erickson, to the point where they assert that he is probably going to be indicted for some form of espionage under her. So somebody there is a spy that contacted him, whether it's her or her boss. But those people exercise a political warfare operation designed to get the Russian Federation through the NRA to Donald Trump. Whether they funneled cash to Donald Trump through their influence, we don't know yet.
All right, thanks to both of you for helping us clear up. This is a remarkable story. It's so remarkable that in the news cycle we've got, it's kind of the side story, and yet it's its own novel and plot on its own. Malcolm Nance, thank you. Joyce Vance, good to see you again. Coming up, it is the most notorious or the most serious humanitarian crisis in the world, and the United States is complicit in it. Nicholas Kristof joins me again. He's just returned from Yemen. I'm going to talk to him about what he saw, the action the Senate took today, and what has to be done to end the catastrophe in Yemen. Today, the United States Senate voted to withdraw American military assistance for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. The 56-41 vote marked bipartisan condemnation of Saudi Arabia, not only for its role in the nearly 4-year war that has killed thousands of civilians and brought famine to Yemen, but also for Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's role in the brutal killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Now, here's the thing. It kind of doesn't matter what happened in the Senate today because outgoing Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan added a rule to the Farm Bill this week that blocks debate on U.S. policy in Yemen, which is amazing because this isn't just Saudi Arabia's war or a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's the world's most serious humanitarian crisis, and the United States is complicit in it. The U.S. not only doesn't sanction Saudi Arabia for participating in it, it doesn't just tacitly support Saudi Arabia. The United States and your tax dollars actively support the efforts of the Saudis in Yemen, efforts that result in the suffering, starvation, and death of absolutely innocent Yemeni civilians. Nick Kristof has just returned from Yemen. He used most of his column space this week for this photograph. Abrar Ibrahim, a 12-year-old Yemeni girl who weighs 28 pounds. Look at this picture. Abrar is, in Nick's words, starving, in part as a consequence of the American-backed Saudi Arabian war in Yemen. Nicholas Kristof joins me now. It is one of those things. Sometimes I say the job of journalists is simply to bear witness. You knew all about Yemen but to go and see the starvation and the suffering of innocent civilians has to have an impact on what you think U.S. policy should be there.
It's devastating. I mean, you know intellectually about these things, and then you walk through a hospital ward where these kids are starving and dying. And, I've covered a lot of famines and nutrition crises around the world. Usually they're caused by droughts, by weather. This time it's caused by a U.S.-backed Saudi policy, by a war that is dropping American bombs on kids, and a blockade that is starving those kids. And to walk through that hospital ward and think that my tax dollars are paying to starve these kids, to bring 12 million people to the abyss of famine. It's
right.
It's
you may have the view that your tax dollars don't need to be spent to solve somebody else's starvation, but the fact is we are contributing to this. Something needs to be done. This was at some point a strategically important war, and at some point had something to do with regional powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia. But when you see these pictures, and I'm just going to ask the control room to keep cycling through those pictures so people can see them.
Yeah, I mean, you had a bunch of people in conference rooms. I mean, essentially, Saudi Arabia wanted to stand up to Iran.
Right.
And Yemen became that battleground. And Saudi Arabia doesn't have a realistic strategy to oust the Iranian-backed rebels, the Houthis, who were there. But what it can do is inflict misery on the population. And so that is what it is doing. The starvation is not an accident of the war. It is a weapon in that war. And we are complicit in that. And I just find it unconscionable it's horrifying to travel around Yemen and to see this. And I was so glad when the Senate stepped up and spoke up. And, I know that Saudi Arabia is paying very close attention to the mood in the U.S. and to the mood in the Senate. I hope that they will indeed then choose to end this war. It's accomplishing nothing except mass starvation.
Right. And thank you to you for bearing witness by showing us these pictures, and your colleagues at the New York Times. Nicholas Kristof is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times. Tonight's Last Word is next. Time for tonight's Last Word. Last night, members of the Kennedy family presented Barack Obama the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Ripple of Hope Award for work in the fight for equality and justice and human rights.
Even there, through the fog of our grief, we see ripples of progress. 6 years ago, Lucy McBath's son was shot and killed in the parking lot of a gas station because the kids in a car were playing music too loud, apparently. And she turned her grief into hope, and her hope into a seat in the next Congress, running unabashedly against the gun lobby in the great state of Georgia. She won.
And that is tonight's Last Word.
The people in the room, they gasped. It then became clear what